Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here today, and thank you to the crowd for joining us as well. We're going to lightly touch on Macau today, but we will go much more in-depth tomorrow. But to start off, junkets are a very important part, especially for Macau. We've seen a lot of changes right now, especially within the past couple of years. What has changed for junkets in Macau, and why is that important? Let me start with Alidad Tash.
Thank you. Actually, junkets, we all know about the unfortunate incidents and the fact that they're not going to be around much longer. However, that's not been the case. Junkets are not quite dead yet. Let me give you a numerical or gaming perspective. Junkets are technically still around. The number of junket operators has shrunk significantly from 300 total junkets a few years back to something in the order of 20s or something. They accounted for 33% of gaming revenue in 2019. This year, they're going to be doing something along the lines of maybe 10, 11%. So 1/3 of what they did. The impact it will have is different though. The government will suffer the entire blow. So when we go from 33% down to, let's say, 11%, the government will lose that 22% in gaming taxes, because for them, $1 in junket is the same as $1 in slots, $1 in mass, $1 in premium mass. However, the operators, because for them, gaming top line, gross gaming revenue is not as important as bottom line, EBITDA or net profit. For them, it's different. Those same 33% of gaming revenue in 2019 only accounted for something around 15% in EBITDA contribution. Therefore, a 2/3 reduction of junket revenue could kind of translate to them losing 10%, going from 15% to 5%. So that's very different. And within the operators, we have some very healthy operators that are so much less reliant on junkets. I guess we're going to talk about it tomorrow. And some that are far more reliant on junkets that will suffer a little bit different.
Let me turn this over to Andy. Will other operators in Asia benefit from the shutdown of junkets in Macau?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, right? And I think a lot of it will depend upon how different jurisdictions choose to look at what's going on in China and what's going on with the junkets, and choose to whether enforce or not enforce some of the Chinese-specific policies. Right? In general, anytime you have change in the industry, I think it represents a lot of opportunity, and this is one of those times where there is a lot of change. Right? And quite frankly, with what's going on with the junkets, I think that the bigger thing is the fact that China has gone from zero COVID to no COVID anymore, and that personally I think is much more exciting than anything else going on in the industry right now. Right? So there's a huge opportunity, not just for Macau, but for the region, right? To then say, we have 1.4 billion people in China that now can travel again. Right? For all the operators out there, I think that is much more interesting than anything that may be going on with the junkets.
Yeah, very true. And like you mentioned, China completely reversed its policy. It was completely zero COVID, which had a huge impact on Macau. We saw 3 years of massive downturns, and then January and February obviously are starting upticks. We're hoping that the first quarter is going to be seeing even more positive recovery. Vitaly, I wanted to ask, in regards to the actual flows of money, there have always been restrictions on capital outflows. What do you think about what is going to be happening now? The junket system has been shut down. That was one of the major ways in which money was able to be moved out of China and into casinos, specifically within Macau, but also other places. What do you think is going to happen now that junkets have been mostly shut down in Macau?
So obviously, the ability to move money for a high-rolling player has been compromised by the elimination of junkets. The reality of the situation, though, is that money constantly leaves China for a variety of reasons. In legal manner, in quasi-legal manner, in underground manner. Some of that gets constrained, some of that reopens, but the reality is that money continues to flow out of China. I think for the gaming operators in Macau and elsewhere that have relied historically on junkets, the issue now becomes, are we actually able to get back any of those junket players because they no longer have kind of the junket function of being able to move money and even provide credit. And I think the answer for some of the operators will be yes to some extent. They'll try to convert some of those junket players into premium direct or direct VIP players. Some of those players will just play at a smaller level and maybe become premium mass players as well, which is all positive for the operators. But in terms of money movement, there are a variety of ways. I mean, we can go through them. This could be a whole discourse on how money moves out of China, and many of them are actually fairly legal. And I think most players actually rely on those outside of the old junket universe. So it's really about, for Macau and for others that have relied historically on junkets, it's really going to be about, are we able to replace that revenue? And it might be from a different type of player, or higher margin, but lower volume player.
Now talking about the movement of people, obviously Chinese gamblers have to be able to get visas in order to come into Macau, even though it's a part of the same country. And China is very selective on how it grants these visas to people who are known to be gamblers. So Alidad, I wanted to ask, what did China mean when it expressed concerns about letting its citizens gamble overseas?
This is very unusual in that China, throughout the pandemic, has given multiple signals. At one point, it was so anti-gaming, we all thought, okay, junkets are completely dead, and we thought everything's going to be super transparent, kind of like the, emasculated junkets that they use in Singapore. And that's not been the case. They've gone from very opaque to very transparent in their statements, and now what the enforcement is, there's something in the middle. China also made another statement that says, we do not welcome gamblers going overseas, which was a gray area. Is Macau overseas or not? Because technically Macau is part of China, but it's also not part of China. The whole one country, two system. So the question is who benefits from the fact that China is going to allow its gamblers going, be it premium mass, be it premium direct. Really, the most logical way would be for Macau benefiting, given the fact that the Chinese government would much rather, A, collect taxes. If I'm going to have a bunch of people lose $40 billion US in gaming revenue, I'd rather make it go to Macau so at least 40% of it gets returned in tax. And number two, I can watch over them and see exactly who does what. So that's a very strange one in that I think that China will continue using its geopolitical flexing of his muscles, and like last week they said, the tour groups are open everywhere except Australia and Korea, right? They will do that, but as to whether or not they're going to make a definitive decision as to whether or not they're going to have junkets or not junkets or premium mass, I still think they're still evaluating it. I think as long as the operators are continuing to do their non-gaming commitments, which are significant, I think they'll be allowed to have these excesses. But if they kind of fall behind, they're going to go, the whip's going to come out.
All right, well, I want to open this up to...
Kelly,
yes,
let me just point one thing out. Alidad talks a lot about Macau. I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that one of the major reasons there was a big crackdown on gambling activity in China, especially as the pandemic began, was with respect to illegal online gaming within China. That precipitated a whole host of negative action by the Chinese government and embroiled the junkets that were in Macau in part of this giant mess, and led partially, I would say partially, to their downfall.
As we saw with Sun City, Alvin Chow.
Exactly, and with Tak Chung. So it's, that's a big factor, and obviously it's not land-based, it's online, but that was a fundamental problem for the Chinese government because it just allowed an inordinate amount of gambling, especially with individuals who were economically unsuited and unable to do gambling without government control and supervision. As Alidad mentioned, places like Macau in particular, where you have a border, you have a visa issuance, there is a monitoring aspect to all of this. Even with money movement, for example, union pay utilization in Macau, that's monitored. It's when you get into areas that have less regulation, less monitoring, and other problems. If you remember a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, there were constantly stories of players being locked up in rooms, from loan sharks, et cetera. That makes headlines and it makes the government look bad. So it's those types of things that need to get reined in and eliminated. But I think overall the government, is fully understanding that its people and people in general are going to go and gamble somewhere. And the question is where.
I think the other thing to remember is the fact that, gaming is a privileged license. It's granted to a set number of operators, and in exchange for that, the operators bring a lot of direct foreign investment and jobs. Right? And that's a really key component to this whole thing. Right? And so, as Vitaly mentioned, I think most governments understand that adults are going to, that a certain subsegment of adults enjoy the activity of gaming. Right? It's better to provide them with a safe and legal place to do so. And in exchange for that, right, the operators help provide jobs and skill building in an environmentally friendly and sustainable manner. And so for China, I can definitely understand wanting to keep that economic activity within their borders. Right? So they reap the benefits of it as well.
Ironically, China is trying to make its gaming very much like the US model, where you go, you know you're going to lose, you're going to participate in a couple hours of gaming, dinner and a show, as opposed to 22 hours straight of gambling and nothing else. All you want is noodles.
And that's what we've seen also with how Macau has been trying to change its branding to a non-gaming destination, attracting more of a younger demographic. And we're going to go too much into Macau right now. I think we need to refocus. We have the whole rest of Asia, which I'm sure you guys want to hear about. Please do come in tomorrow as well. We will go much more into depth into Macau, both gaming and non-gaming. Shifting away from Macau, we were talking about how China has recently opened up, which is huge news for all of the Asian gaming destinations and gaming destinations worldwide. I wanted to ask Vitaly, where are they going?
Well, I think, outbound visitation has begun. It's still, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's still at a fairly low level. Domestically, travel in China has boomed and is basically back to pre-COVID levels. Outbound visitation is still low. Macau is Macau, which is basically the easiest place to get to, is still nowhere back to being at 2019 levels. So the travelers are going. I mean, Alidad mentioned the group travel, which is a little bit of a different type of travel experience. That's been reopened, but several jurisdictions, Korea, Australia, are not part of that group travel. Does that impact things too much? Not really. If an individual wants to get on an airplane and go somewhere, as long as they don't have issues in China, they can pretty much do so. The question is, where do people kind of want to make that first trip? If you're gambling, Macau's easy, right? If you're in Guangdong, you're driving in or taking a train, whatever. If you're getting on a plane, you're doing a short haul trip. But then there's other individuals that have to go for business, for example, whether it's Cambodia, whether it's Philippines, whether it's Singapore, and that becomes kind of a dual trip. So that's all beginning, but I think it's going to still take a while to get there, largely because airlift capacity is not anywhere near being back to normal.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Singapore, because while Macau saw a downturn, Singapore did manage to open up much earlier, and there was a return to growth. So Andy, how have you seen that so far, and do you think that Singapore is going to continue to see the same levels of visitation now that Macau is also open?
Yeah, well, I think that Singapore was a huge beneficiary in the last couple of years. As you say, right, they had a clear strategy. They welcomed people in and out of Singapore a lot quicker than most other places. At least from Hong Kong, there were many people that relocated to Singapore. What we're starting to see now is a lot of them are coming back to Hong Kong. Now that China's opening back up again, a lot of people, I think, are going to reshuffle where they are or where they have been for the last few years. But fundamentally, Singapore's strong, right? Singapore has a compelling product. The two operators there do a fantastic job. But I believe longer term, what you'll see in Singapore is some growth over the next few years. But then I think they're going to reach a saturation point. As you look at the numbers, I think ultimately the Philippines and the Manila market will overtake Singapore in a meaningful way and continue to grow.
Do you mean in terms of GGR or in terms of new openings?
Sorry, in terms of GGR, right? Versus I think Singapore, you'll see it capped out in the near future.
Singapore has been extremely boring in that, and it's actually, people like it because they've been hovering around 5 billion. They're maxed out, 99% occupancy in Marina Bay Sands. They're maxed out, capped out. Whether or not you add Chinese or not, there's enough gamblers elsewhere to be able to recover it. Now, within the next couple of years, they're going to be adding 1,000 more rooms. So their new equilibrium is going to go from 4 or 5 billion to 6 billion, 6.5. And after that, they're capped out again until they get more capacity. So that's what I'm saying. It's consistent, it's reliable, unlike the Macau that went way up and way down and up and down. Singapore is very good for investment, zero surprises, and again, no seasons, they're an equator, also not much fluctuation.
Well, what about Macau, though? I mean, there are no new other contenders in the market. After the new gaming licenses, which are coming into effect for 10 years, the 6 concessionaires got the licenses again. They also have pledged a large amount of money in gaming and non-gaming, but do you think Macau is also going to be similar to the Singapore story, where it'll plateau and nothing else is going to happen? This is open to all of you.
Look, I think in the end, for most of these markets with respect to gaming, the issue becomes capacity constraints, less so around the gaming side and more so on hotels, right? So you have a local market in virtually every market that allows locals. That market is your primary market Monday through Thursday. People just come in, they stay for an hour or two, they leave. That market is fairly easy, although it is highly competitive. When you start talking about destination visitors that are coming for 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights, 4 nights, you have to have hotel rooms. And you will reach peak capacity at a certain point in different markets without the addition of new hotel rooms. In Singapore, it's very, very clear because there's only 2 operators. There's a fixed number of rooms. Yes, there's ancillary hotel operations all around Singapore, but they cater significantly other businesses all across Singapore. So unless you have your own room capacity, you're going to be capped. This has been the problem at Marina Bay Sands. It capped out at 1.6, 1.7 billion of EBITDA, running at 99% occupancy and $450 ADRs. That's pretty good. Like, you can't do much better. You can't fill that sausage any further, right? So Macau, similarly, with about 37,000 rooms in operation, once all the labor's back, it will reach a certain level of capacity, especially as the market has migrated away from extremely high-rolling large junket players, and it's being augmented by mass, premium mass, and that's volumes. So you need those hotel rooms. And I think the question for a place like Macau is going to be, will the government allow the further build out of non-gaming, but hotel room capacity, which is critical.
Which is one of the tricky parts, because, for example, Hon Chin Island, which is right literally 1 kilometer away from Macau, has been designated non-gaming. So will there be dormitories for people to stay there and then come and play in Macau? That's a big question mark. But again, what's remarkable about Macau is it achieved, 5-6 times what Las Vegas Strip did with 1/5 the number of hotel rooms. Vegas has 150,000 hotel rooms at least, probably more now. Macau's got 4-star, 5-star hotel rooms, even less than 30,000. And with all the addition, is going to be at 35-ish at the most once everything else comes in.
Yeah, and the big difference though is, everyone looks at the gaming revenue, but not the non-gaming revenue, right? In Vegas, the non-gaming revenue is twice what the gaming revenue is. So if you look at total revenue for Macau and Vegas is still smaller, but it's not as small as people assume. And the 155,000 rooms in Vegas, don't forget, 20% of the business in Vegas is convention, where people are staying 4 to 5 days, 4 to 5 nights. Whereas in Macau, average stay is 1 night. So, but the hotel rooms are critical because you actually need them, and especially on weekends if we're talking about short haul visitation.
Look, I know we're going to talk a lot more about Macau tomorrow, but just one more thing to keep in mind is that long term, I think Macau is extremely well positioned. Right? In 26 years, all the borders come down, all the currency problems go away. As it reintegrates back into China, I think the future looks very, very, very bright for Macau.
Well, that's an interesting point that you bring up, because China itself does not allow gambling. I mean, it does have the lottery format, but Macau is the only place where you can have legal casino gambling. So I want to speak a little bit about local gambling. So let's shift our focus a little bit to South Korea. There are only certain places which are allowed to have local gamblers. Do you think that that is going to change at all, yet again, for the group?
Korea has only one casino, which is busier than, I went there back in 2018 on a boring Tuesday, Wednesday, nothing special going on, and I could not get a seat. You had to give a text. You actually had to have a number texted to you. 2 hours later, somebody said, table 204, seat 3 is available for an hour and a half.
You waited 2 hours to sit down at a gambling table?
Yes, yes. That's how busy it is. However, you go everywhere else, foreigner-only casinos, everything else, they only have 3 or 4 IRs. Everything else is small casinos. And there's hopes that, for example, Inspire opening up this year, Paradise.
The first stage.
Huh? First stage. They're going to do something. But the only critical decision that would have been made, or the pressure that would have happened, would have been Japan opening. Had Japan opened on time, which would have been by now, the Korean government, it was hoped, would see all its citizens migrate and lose billions overseas in Japan, which is right there, and say, maybe we could tax that. Without that, why in the world would the government want to go ahead and allow its citizens doing that, given the fact that there's all these negative associations?
Well, and we saw that actually this past year. There were not very impressive revenues coming out of Korea. So would that then possibly encourage the idea to open up more to local gambling, local gamblers?
Look, I think longer term, if you look at the 3 major regions, being the US, Asia, and then Europe, you see a bifurcation. Right? The US, anything goes. Right? Let's have guns in schools and everything else. Right? And
not a highlight of the country.
Yeah. And in Europe, you're kind of going the other way, right? With a lot of AML and KYC and GDPR concerns, and so a lot of government intervention, right? In Asia, it's kind of a mixed bag. Right? We heard from the chairman of PANCOR here talk earlier about partnering with all the operators and seeing a thriving industry, and I think I counted at least 15 times he used the term nation building, and I think that's a healthy approach for the industry. Right? And I think longer term, if you go throughout Asia and look jurisdiction by jurisdiction, I kind of believe that most countries are moving in that direction. Right? You look at Vietnam, they're piloting locals gaming. Right? You look at Thailand, that is, cannabis and CBD is now legal, and we'll hear tomorrow, I believe, from some speakers on that. You look at, as Alidad mentioned, in Korea, there's at least talks of potential. Right? And I think as we move forward in the next few years, yeah, I do believe that there will be more relaxing for locals to enjoy the gaming product.
Well, speaking of the regulation of markets, we did see just recently that Cambodia managed to get itself off of the FATF gray list. So we are generally progressing towards more regulation, more oversight, more desire to shift away from the gray market. What does that mean for some of these upcoming markets?
I think in the long run, the more regulated you are, yet still able to do business, the better it is, because it allows for more competitive investment. It allows for the government to get comfortable with the activity that takes place. So that is actually always a good direction, right? It might have some impact because you have to change your business model for the existing incumbents, but overall, improving regulation, still in a capitalistic perspective, that actually works quite well. And I think it's been done numerous times across various jurisdictions, including in places like the US, that went from completely unregulated gambling in certain states to well-regulated industries that employ a lot of locals, that provide tax revenue for schools, and importantly have responsible gaming programs that try to reduce problem gaming, right? We haven't talked about this at all, but I think from a regulated perspective, that's an important aspect of what industry is supposed to be doing, is try to limit that type of activity. And the better regulated industries that have better operators who focus on that, I think in the long run, that's actually a much better industry, because it allows the population of that jurisdiction to actually support the industry.
But isn't that going to lead to a certain type of consolidation? Because all these smaller operators will not be able to have the capital to be able to abide by all the regulations that they're currently skipping in the gray markets.
That's the reality of every industry.
True, absolutely.
Right. You actually don't, look, you don't want to have a monopolist necessarily, but you look at a market like Singapore, which
But it's working in Malaysia.
It is. The question is, would the Malaysian market be better for all of Malaysia if there was actually a bit more competition in Malaysia, right? You can't give a definitive answer, yes or no. You can theorize. But if you look at even a place like Singapore, granted it's a small city state, you know, they have a duopoly. What does a duopoly do? It leads to competition, right? And competition leads to thought, that leads to changes, right? And you kind of need that evolution in whatever industry we're talking about, and gaming is no different.
I mean, the two jurisdictions that are closest to home for us here, you know, in Macau and here in Manila, I think have benefited a lot from competition in the last 15 years, right? I mean, if we look at the facility we're sitting in here right now, right? I mean, it's a phenomenal facility here, and you know, with the other operators here as well, right? Really elevated the product. Same thing with Macau, right? At 40 years of a monopoly and a certain level of product, and then very quickly, once you liberalized the industry, a lot of innovation, a lot of direct foreign investment, a lot of job creation.
It also led to pretty much the downfall of the company that was the main operator.
Not really, right? Because if you actually look at it, that company, I believe, well, you know, pre-COVID, was making more money as one, you know, playing in a market with 5 other direct competitors than it did as monopolist.
And the goal of government shouldn't be to prop up a monopolist. Right? I mean, monopoly power economically has been proven to be quite bad virtually everywhere. So instilling competition is actually critically important.
Andy mentioned Asia and the fact that it's somewhere between Europe and the US. Well, Asia is not very homogeneous, so kind of to come back to the Korea question, look at Japan. They've been talking about gaming since early 2000s. It was supposed to be before the Tokyo Olympics. The reason, and again, 2016, 17, I think about a dozen mayors raised their hands and they were all excited. Almost every single one of them, with the exception of 2, were voted out of office because the perception of the Japanese citizen is that they are one of the 10,000 pachinko parlors, these kind of not the most attractive, tiny joints where they have nothing but gaming and only gaming. No mice, no nothing. They're just a little parlor where you just have hardcore gaming. They thought that the next casino, the next IR, is just going to be one of those little things times 100. Only through an actual IR being selected, most likely MGM, once they make a decision, if they make a decision, only through them doing it, going through all the local opposition, getting it done and showing to these people, which have they can't fathom, they cannot imagine what this looks like. Once they see it, every other mayor is going to raise their hand and say, see, look at this. It's not necessarily gaming. Look at the mice, look at the visitation. So it almost becomes like a mini Singapore, right? Singapore is what prompted all the jurisdictions to kind of get in on it. Macau was always gaming, and yeah, sure, it helped. But Singapore is what showed how much visitation can be added because of it. So what's that? It's going to be a domino effect. Once Japan gets more IRs 7 years after MGM, which will be 3 or 4 years from now, so 4 plus 7, 11 years from now, then Korea, the domino in Korea will fall because then realize everybody's going there, and then Korea will accept it. These things don't happen just kind of naturally. There's got to be some incident or some politician saying, wow, why can't we have that at home?
But I mean, you mentioned the perception challenge within Japan. Companies came in and spent hundreds of millions of dollars to give them exactly that impression. These are going to be the advantages. So why has it been so difficult to get to this stage?
Because politically, look at Wakayama last year. They were one of only 3 men standing, right? Osaka was there, Nagasaki was there, Wakayama, they got all the bid, they got everything approved, and then politically, they got like by a vote of 2, like 22 to 20 or some very, very close vote. They voted themselves out. They literally committed harakiri. They said, we don't want it, even though the company was ready to do it because of political pressure. Their perception, I mean, the voters have a lot to say there.
Look, local support, popular support for the expansion or development of this industry is critically important. Yeah. You look at the US, okay, which is I think a good example of Asia, right? You have individual states. You look at a place like Texas, which is the 2nd largest feeder market into Las Vegas. It does not have casinos. Yet it has casinos in the north, in Oklahoma, the east, right, in Louisiana, and then in Vegas, right? But they still haven't moved forward. Why? Because of cultural local opposition. Now that opposition over time has been reduced, but it's still the majority opposition. At some point, I think Texas will have gaming. At some point, Korea is likely to have locals gaming. Is that in the next couple of years? Very unlikely. Is it in the next 2 decades? More likely, right? But I think it's very difficult to handicap.
So let's briefly touch on one of the other potential jurisdictions, Thailand. What do you all think is going to happen in Thailand? Anything?
At the rate it's going, it's probably faster than Japan. There, hopefully, it's less of a democratic decision. It's just a matter of whether or not politically the king and the politicians are okay. And once they do that, they're going to give the green light. I know for a fact that multiple IRs are doing plans and everything else for the, that day where it's going to happen. Like everybody said here, it's inevitable. The question is just the when. And I think it's going to be spectacular. I think the service, I think they're going to be benefiting. If they do it right, if they do the Singapore model with the strict regulation, they get the infrastructure right, and that's all critical. Infrastructure, regulation, life is good. Because there's going to be tons of billions upon billions of money in terms of reinvestment, because everybody believes in Thailand.
We are going to go more into depth into Thailand, but I just wanted to ask in terms of location. They had mentioned something like 22 potential places including Bangkok, Phuket, Chiang Mai. What would be the advantage of having a casino or an IR in Bangkok, for example? Is there any?
Well, look, it all boils down to what the objective of the government actually is. If they want to make Bangkok more of an international business destination and you put up a Marina Bay Sands type property has a large MICE component and a Asian-wide marketing capability, that could be an advantage for Bangkok if that's what the government wants to happen in Bangkok. If it wants to become a more pan-Asian business city, doing something of that scale would make sense. The reason why I think there is talk of having kind of these smaller casino operations in many of these tourist resorts is largely to kind of diversify or augment the tourist environment in those cities, raise more revenue, give more employment. Both of those models could actually work. You could have a large-scale integrated resort, even 2 resorts in and around Bangkok, and have smaller, couple $100 million really resorts with a casino attached to them in some of the other kind of local jurisdictions. But in the end, it boils down to, will the government be capable or desire to build a regulatory infrastructure that achieves these goals? Because there's a danger it goes off path and we turn into like a Vietnam situation where it's been talked about for decades and we see what happens in Vietnam, right? So the opportunity is definitely there. The question is really going to be, will the government move in the right direction in terms of kind of regulatory framework?
But I mean, for that, not only in terms of, for example, a tender, if you were going to have major IR contenders come in willing to spend billions of dollars, and then also have a possibility for smaller casinos, you'd have to build legislation which is going to be able to be selective for each one of these types of scales, right? So is that not a legislative, let's say, road bump?
Well, it isn't, it isn't. I mean, you can have a variety of regulations that impact those casinos, right? Like, you can prevent locals in casinos in, for example, Phuket, but allow locals under a Singapore-type model in a Bangkok $5 billion, $4 billion integrated resort, right? You could have different tax rates, right, for different types of property. So there's a whole host of things that you can do. It doesn't mean, if casinos are allowed in Thailand, they're all the same, right? That doesn't have to be the case.
I think the mistake that England made when it came to casinos. Every time they want to do an IR, they've had casinos forever, tiny casinos. Every time they want to build an integrated resort, they put it in some old, industrial suffering city in the middle of nowhere, so there is no infrastructure, and it fails. It never does what it's supposed to, whereas you want to put it in London. Look at Philippines. The day it went and it started competing with everybody else, Entertainment City. We're sitting right next to Manila. All the flights are already there, so the infrastructure is there. They built that little roadway over here, made it even easier. So if you want to do Bangkok, Don't put it in some remote area. Put it in Bangkok, Thailand. Put it in Bangkok. Once people get it comfortable, then you go do it in Phuket. Then you do it on some of the other areas, or maybe simultaneous.
None of these casinos would be able to exist without customers. And obviously the opening up of China to the world has been a huge part of that in the returning revenues. But Andy, I wanted to ask you, will the pent-up demand get spent? For example, we're going to see a great return in revenues this year, but then is it going to trail off?
I think it's, no, I absolutely think it's here to stay, right? In fact, Vitaly talked about this a little bit earlier, that even though travel is opened up again, it's still not where it needs to be. There's just basic issues around getting pilots back into their jobs and getting them recertified, and even the aircraft itself, right? Getting that all serviced and online. It's just going to take some time. And so I actually think things are going to be bright for the next few years here as you see the return of the Chinese foreign traveler. Right? If you look at what happened during the Spanish flu from earlier in the 20th century.
Wow, that's a throwback.
That led to the Roaring *20s, right? And a prolonged period of economic growth. I would hopefully that's what we're going to see here, and not the world sliding into a global recession.
Any other comments on that?
Look, and structurally in Asia long term, the ability of the gaming industry to continue to grow and expand is largely going to be dependent on the number of people that enter the middle class, the number of people that have disposable income to spend on gaming and other, call it entertainment, leisure activities. That's what's going to drive this industry going forward. Initially, the return of Chinese customers, et cetera, that's critically important over the next couple of years. But if you think about the secular growth capability of this industry, it's tied to improving incomes, wealth, ability to travel, improving transportation, and then building capacity in places where people want to go and having them able to do things that they really want to do. That's where it becomes important. And you could have gaming jurisdictions all across Asia in a much greater scale than we have today over some time frame.
The reason Asia will succeed is because it recognizes integrated resorts are so much more important to the economy than just casinos. And the reason Europe hasn't had a successful integrated resort is because they have more casinos than anywhere else in the world. They have thousands of casinos, but because they're not attached to a large building with mice and food and restaurants and shopping and everything else, that's one of the reasons that it's just not very appealing.
Well, I mean, we see in Macau, for example, where on average people only stay about 1 day. The MICE visitors do spend more, they stay longer. They're shifting to a mass model. Macau is becoming less reliant on VIP as it's seen by shutting down the junkets. What I heard a lot from what you said just now, Vitaly, was that we're moving more towards the focus on that middle class customer. Does that mean that we're seeing the overall decline of VIP? Will they eventually stop being important?
Look, I think high rollers are important for virtually every casino operation because you need, one large, very well-appointed suite versus 30 standard rooms, right? So from that perspective, the high rolling customers are still critically important. Even if you go to the US, which is a much more of a mass market type of gaming environment, high rollers, large customers for casinos are still critically important. So I just think on a relative basis, in terms of historical importance, definitely those high rollers are declining in importance. But in order to get the real mass business, with gaming and non-gaming to work, is you need to have capacity. And it's not just hotel rooms, it's everything else that goes along with it. Restaurants, some form of entertainment. In order to get someone to stay for more than a day, you're going to need a lot more hotel rooms and a lot more restaurants and a lot more ancillary activities for individuals to do, aside from just sitting at a table for 8 hours a day.
The good news as it pertains to Macau is, I think we're pretty close to critical mass on those things. Right? I mean, it is, if you haven't been there recently, I mean, it is much, much, much more built out than it used to be, right?
We don't have any more room to build on, right?
Right. I mean, there's wide variety of restaurants and other entertainment options, and especially now with the license and concession renewals, a commitment to doing events and non-gaming promotions. Right? So I think they're very bullish, right? Exciting times ahead.
Well, we are running out of time, but I did want to open up to the audience for just a few questions before we finish. Would anybody like to ask a question from our very intelligent panel here? Going once. Going twice. Yes, I see a hand over there.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, everyone. Tony from APE, Macau. I've been recently spending a lot of time in Thailand, so I'm particularly interested in how Thailand would develop. Do you think with, there's a new election coming on in April? Do you think the government would go the way of Singapore, where they will give out 1 or 2 concessions, or will it go the way of Thailand and Philippines, where they'll give out multiple concessions? Thank you.
I'm not familiar enough with the politics as to whether or not which decision they will make, but the most rational decision when you have a brand new virgin territory, you'd want to go start with 1 or 2, work out the kinks, and then add some more, kind of like the way Japan did its first round, and then 7 years later will be the second round. I think that makes the most sense. But in terms of who does what and what's going on, I think there's a panel dedicated just to that, I believe, coming up.
I mean, the flip side of that, of course, is the fact that you want to, if you're the government and you want to spread around the economic benefit of this activity, then it makes sense to have multiple competitors come in, right, and grant them to 4 or 5 different local or some partnerships with international players to spread around the economic benefits of it.
Yeah, well, I think it's impossible for anyone to sit here and know exactly what the government's going to do. I think, if I were advising the government, I would tell them to do a larger scale integrated resort in and around Bangkok, and then cap smaller properties in several other tourist jurisdictions that tremendously limit locals, and leave the local business to the larger, well-invested, better regulated, better governed, better managed, large-scale integrated resort. But in the end, the local kind of gives and takes are really going to pull what happens in Thailand, and I think it's impossible for us to actually sit here and understand exactly what's going to wind up happening. It's going to be an evolving process.
Well, gentlemen, I think we have to wrap it up. I wanted to thank you again very much for your time. I know we had a lot of territory to cover there, both figuratively and literally. Yet again, could I get a big round of applause for the panel here? Vitaly Umansky, Andy Choy, and Alidad Tash.